Welcome back. The United Nations has a 575-page hot potato on its hands. So does the Israeli government, the Palestinian Authority, and the global news media. It's the so-called Goldstone report, the results of an investigation carried out by the UN's Human Rights Council into the 3-week-long war on Gaza that Israel launched last December. The report concluded that both Israeli forces and Palestinian militants were guilty of war crimes and possible crimes against humanity. The coverage of this story has been all over the place, starting in Israel, where the lead investigator, Richard Goldstone, has been accused of anti-Semitism and of being out to get Israel. Goldstone is a South African Jew. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on the report, how the politicians are handling it, and how the media, from the U.S. to Palestine and Israel, are reporting the story.
The casualty figures show how one-sided this conflict was. More than 1,000 Palestinians were killed compared to 13 Israelis. Hundreds of Palestinian civilians died compared to just 3 Israeli civilians. An estimated 300 of the Palestinian dead were children. The reporting of the story was limited because that's how Israel wanted it. The vast majority of the foreign news media were locked out of Gaza. But there were exceptions.
Palestinian human rights organizations say this is the bloodiest day since 1967.
6 months ago, a United Nations fact-finding mission was set up to see whether violations of human rights had taken place during the Gaza conflict. Headed by experienced war crimes judge Richard Goldstone, it came under attack from Israel before it had even started.
I think that the government had a clear line of strategy in how to deal with the Goldstone report, really from the moment the inquiry was set up, because by saying to the inquiry they weren't going to comply, they immediately delegitimized it so that when the final report came out, they could say, well, it didn't have the Israeli side.
I think there was certainly a great deal of skepticism here in Israel. The cards seemed very much stacked against Israel from the very beginning. You also had the makeup of the investigative team, including one member, Christine Chinkin, who had signed a letter that was printed in London's Sunday Times, that before the investigation had actually begun, she'd signed this letter which condemned Israel for its war crimes in Gaza. So I think those were signs that Israel was going to get a raw deal.
The report's findings were damning. It concluded that actions amounting to war crimes, and possibly in some respects crimes against humanity, were committed by the Israel Defense Force. It recommended that if Israel did not independently investigate the allegations, then it should be brought before the International Criminal Court.
The mission came to the conclusion that those attacks, which had no military justification, amounted to collective punishment and/or reprisals and constituted war crimes.
When the Goldstone report was released only 3 days before the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, the news hit Israel like a bomb.
Israeli officials are furious and reject the findings.
Israeli officials like Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu sprung into immediate action.
For 8 long years, Hamas fired rockets,
appearing on Israeli and Western media outlets in a 24-hour frenzy, and were given plenty of time to vent out and lash out at the report.
Not all Israeli media backed their government. As usual, opinions were split.
Immediately following the release of the Goldstone report, we saw a pretty typical response by the Israeli media. So you had the more leftist commentators like Amira Hass and Gideon Levy, who were talking about the moral bankruptcy of Israel and took a very much I told you so approach to it. Whereas you had the rightist papers, the Hebrew papers like Marev, taking a very nationalist approach to the Goldstone report, really talking about how this is evidence that the whole world is against us, that people out there are anti-Semitic. Of course, it then put a spanner in the works that the person who compiled this report was in fact Jewish himself.
Goldstone was dismissed as a South African who misunderstood the situation in Israel. A campaign was fought through the media to discredit the report.
Israel has launched a major diplomatic campaign to try to contain the damage caused by the Goldstone report on Operation Cast Lead.
Very little media attention was focused on the substantive conclusions of the report.
Well, the fact that this report is biased, not professional, I would say it's a given.
Almost all the discussion was on whether Israel would be successful in getting it sidelined and avoid bringing it before the General Assembly and the Security Council.
So again, are you saying that it was intentional in Israel?
Certainly, some of it was intentional. There was no mistake about the bombing of civilian buildings.
Goldstone criticised Israel for their disproportionate response, but there was no real answer to what a proportionate response would be. That kind of morality, but without any practicality, for a lot of Israelis meant that the report was pretty much worthless.
Arab media welcomed the report, but were selective in what they highlighted.
Arab media celebrated the Goldstone report, and it seemed that many news anchors and commentators had forgotten or even ignored to read the section of the report where it explicitly blamed Hamas for targeting Israeli civilians in Sderot and other Israeli towns and villages. If anything, Arab media focused on images of death and destruction inflicted on Gaza by the Israelis.
Israel sought to control and limit coverage of the war. By dismissing the legitimacy of this report, it's striving once again to deflect attention away from what happened on the ground in Gaza. It's not certain how long that policy will work.
Israel has been skillful in the past in ignoring critical pronouncements from the international community, so the furor that surrounded the release of the Goldstone report is a kind of new experience.
The cleverest thing really about Israel's PR and media machine was that it somehow created the image that this was a war being fought between two equal armies, two equal sides with equal weaponry. So the Palestinian civilians that were killed were legitimately killed in the crossfire. And the Goldstone report, as well as other reports and testimonies by Israeli soldiers themselves, really shatter that image. So what's surprising is just the amount of people and the news organizations that buy into the Israeli narrative, when really it's only the Israeli state that's selling it.
More Global Village Voices now on Goldstone, Gaza, and the media.
The United States has played an important role in not only blocking this politically, but in its coverage. The U.S. media, instead of detailing the conclusions that Goldstone made in the report, have instead focused on the report by accusing the members of being anti-Semitic, of calling Mr. Goldstone a self-hating Jew, accusing Mr. Goldstone and his committee of having an anti-Israeli bias.
The Goldstone report is simply an effort to aid and abet world terrorists. That's all it did. Unbiased observers said no country's ever fought more morally than Israel did. And this UN report, the UN is always biased against Israel, as is the world media, totally ignored that. The war crimes were committed by Hamas in sending those missiles. That should be the outcry.
The media's response to the Goldstone report is typical in the way, like the report itself, it erroneously depicts a war of equivalence when it was yet another Israeli massacre. Coverage of the report detaches Gaza from 61 years of war crimes committed by Zionist-occupied Palestine.
Finally, every once in a while here at the Listening Post, we have arguments over what web video of the week we should show you. I lost this week's argument. The staff here didn't like my idea of another web video on Barack Obama and the U.S. healthcare wars. Too boring, they said. Let's show them that head-banging cockatoo from California instead. It's hard to argue with more than 1.2 million hits and a bird that has much better rhythm than I do. So here's Frosty bopping along to the Blues Brothers. We'll see you next time at the Listening Post.